Stop. Before you scroll past this video, I want you to think about something for just 10 seconds. You have seen the face of Jesus thousands of times, in churches, in paintings, in movies, on billboards, on television. Long blonde hair, blue or green eyes, fair skin, a European face. That image is so familiar, so universal, that most people never stop to ask a simple question. Where did that image come from? Because here is what nobody tells you in school. That image, the one burned into the global imagination, did not exist for the first 300 years of Christianity. Not a single painting, not a single mosaic, not a single carving. For 3 full centuries after Jesus walked the earth, nobody drew him that way. So who created it? When? And why? The answer leads us to one of the most powerful political decisions in the history of the Western world. And when you see the actual physical evidence hiding in plain sight in Roman catacombs, in ancient Ethiopian manuscripts, and in modern genetic science, you are going to understand why this story has been buried for 1,700 years. Stay with me, because this is not a theory. This is history, and it changes everything. Let's start at the beginning. The year is 30 CE. Give or take a few years. A Jewish preacher from the region of Galilee is traveling through the ancient land of Judea. His name, in the original Aramaic language he spoke every single day, was Yeshua, not Jesus, Yeshua. He was born in that region, he lived in that region. He was surrounded every single day by people who looked like the people of that region. People with dark skin, dark eyes, dark, tightly coiled hair. This is not a radical claim. This is basic historical geography. The ancient Levant, the land that today includes Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, was populated by people who carried the physical features of the African and Middle Eastern world. Every serious archaeologist and historian agrees on this basic point. And yet, by the year 400 CE, just 4 centuries after his death, Jesus had become a man with pale skin, flowing blonde hair, and the facial features of a Roman nobleman. How does that happen? How does a Jewish preacher from the Middle East transform into a European aristocrat in less than 400 years? That is the question at the heart of this video. And to answer it, we need to go to a specific city in a specific year where one of the most consequential decisions in human history was made. The year is 325 CE. The Roman Emperor Constantine I has just done something nobody expected. He has declared Christianity the favored religion of the Roman Empire. This is a seismic shift. For the previous 300 years, Christians had been persecuted, imprisoned, and executed by Rome. Now suddenly, Rome wants to lead Christianity, and the first order of business is control. Constantine summons church leaders from across the empire to a city called Nicaea in what is today northwestern Turkey. The Council of Nicaea is famous in religious history for establishing core Christian doctrine, but here is what most people do not discuss. The Council of Nicaea was also the moment when the Roman Empire took control of how Christianity looked, how it was organized, how it was practiced, and who it served. Think about this from a purely political standpoint. If you are Rome, if you have spent 300 years trying to suppress a religious movement that is spreading through Africa and the Middle East, and now you have decided to absorb that movement and control it from the inside, what is the single most powerful tool you have? The image, the face, the visual identity of the founder of the movement. Because whoever controls the image of Jesus controls the emotional center of the entire religion. This is not speculation. This is the logic of every empire in human history. Rome was not the first to understand this, and it was not the last. Let me ask you something right now. If you grew up in America, in a Christian household, or even just in Western culture, what did Jesus look like in your imagination? I want you to pause for 1 second and think about that image. Now ask yourself, who gave you that image? Was it your church? Was it a painting in a museum? Was it a Hollywood movie? Now, here is the real question. Drop it in the comments below. Did anyone ever show you what the oldest surviving image of Jesus actually looks like? Because I guarantee it looks nothing like what you were shown. Let us talk about physical evidence, because this is where the historical record stops being abstract and becomes concrete. Beneath the city of Rome, there is a vast network of underground tunnels and burial chambers called the Roman catacombs. And inside these ancient tunnels, carved into the soft volcanic rock, are some of the oldest surviving Christian artwork in the world, dating back to the 2nd and 3rd century CE. These are not paintings made by Renaissance artists in the 1400s. These are not Byzantine mosaics commissioned by emperors. These are raw, humble, hand-painted images made by the early Christian community, people who were still being persecuted, people who had to practice their faith underground, literally. And the figure painted on those catacomb walls does not have blonde hair, does not have pale European skin. The figure in the catacomb of Kamadilla, one of the oldest surviving images of Jesus in existence, shows a man with dark, curly hair, a wide nose, a broad face, with features that scholars consistently describe as consistent with populations from North Africa and the Middle East. The catacomb of Priscilla contains some of the earliest surviving depictions of biblical scenes, and the figures in those paintings carry the visual characteristics of Semitic and African peoples. Now here is what makes this significant. These paintings predate the Council of Nicaea. They were made before Rome took control of Christianity, made by communities who were closer in time to the actual historical figure they were depicting. And they do not match the blonde, blue-eyed image that came later. Something changed after 325 CE. The visual record shifted, and it shifted rapidly, not gradually, not organically, but with the speed and coordination that only centralized political power can produce. Now I want to take you to a source that millions of people have read their entire lives, but have somehow never connected to this question. The Book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. This is one of the only physical descriptions of Jesus that exists anywhere in the biblical text, and it reads in its most direct translation like this: "His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace." Let's stop right there. Hair like wool, not flowing, not straight, not silky, wool. Feet like burnished bronze, not pale, not olive, not golden, bronze, refined in a furnace, dark, rich, metallic brown. Now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, with roots stretching back to the 1st century CE, has preserved manuscripts and artistic traditions that take this description literally. In that tradition, the physical description in Revelation is not symbolic. It is meant to be read exactly as written: hair like wool, skin like burnished bronze. This is not a fringe interpretation. This is what the text actually says. The question worth asking, and I encourage you to research this yourself, is why this description is so rarely discussed in Western Christian teaching. Why is the most direct physical description of Jesus in the entire Bible consistently spiritualized, reinterpreted, or simply ignored in mainstream Western Christianity? That is a question worth sitting with. Here is a debate I want to start in the comments right now. Do you think the physical appearance of Jesus matters to the practice of Christianity? Or do you think it is irrelevant, that the teachings are what matter, not the face? There is no wrong answer here. I genuinely want to know what you think, because this debate has been dividing historians and theologians for decades. Drop your perspective below, and let's have a real conversation. Now, let us move into territory that is newer and perhaps more controversial, because in the last 2 decades, advances in ancient DNA analysis have allowed scientists to extract and study the genetic material of people who lived thousands of years ago. And some of those findings have directly intersected with the question of who the ancient Judean population actually was. Here's what the science shows, and I want to be precise because this area is often misrepresented in both directions. The ancient population of Judah, the kingdom that Jesus came from historically, carried a genetic profile that, according to studies of ancient Levantine DNA, shows close affinity with populations across North Africa and the broader African continent. This is peer-reviewed science, not conspiracy, not ideology. The implications of this research, when placed alongside the catacomb paintings and the Revelation text, form a consistent picture that the standard Western narrative about the historical Jesus does not account for. And I want to be careful here, because this is where interpretation diverges from evidence. The science does not prove anything specific about one individual. What it does suggest is that the physical appearance of the European Jesus, in the context of what we know about the genetic profile of that region and that population, is historically inconsistent. Let us come back to Rome, because the how matters just as much as the what. After the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the Roman Empire had both the motive and the machinery to reshape the visual identity of Christianity. Here's how it worked. First, Rome controlled the scriptoriums, the institutions housed in churches and monasteries where manuscripts were copied by hand. Every Bible, every theological text, every piece of Christian literature passed through scriptoriums that were, by the 4th century, largely under Roman ecclesiastical control. This meant that any image commissioned for those manuscripts went through a centralized filtering process. Second, Rome controlled the major artistic commissions. The grand churches built after Constantine, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, were decorated with mosaics and paintings commissioned and paid for by the imperial court. When the emperor pays the artists, the emperor influences the art. Third, Rome had an explicit theological agenda. Christianity was being used to unify a crumbling empire. An empire that was predominantly European in its power centers: Rome, Constantinople, Milan, Antioch. A religion centered on a dark-skinned, African-featured Jewish preacher from a colonized territory did not serve the narrative of Roman imperial Christianity. A religion centered on a noble, fair-skinned, European-looking figure, one that looked like the ruling class, served that narrative perfectly. This is not unique to Rome. Every empire in history has done this. The process of taking a movement, reshaping its symbols, and redirecting its power towards the ruling class is as old as civilization itself. Within a century after Nicaea, the European Jesus had become the dominant visual tradition across the Roman Christian world. The earlier images, the dark-featured Jesus of the catacombs, did not disappear immediately, but they were no longer being replicated, no longer being commissioned, no longer being held up as the standard. They faded, and the new image took their place. I want to challenge you with something here. Imagine you are a scholar in the year 325 CE. You've been summoned to Nicaea. You know the history. You know what the texts say. You know what the old paintings look like. Do you speak up or do you stay quiet? Because speaking up means going against the most powerful empire on earth. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Because the people who were in that room faced exactly that choice. And the choice they made, or did not make, shaped the next 1,700 years of religious history. Now, here is where the story becomes hopeful, or at least illuminating, because Rome's reach was not total. There were corners of the Christian world where Roman imperial influence did not fully penetrate. and in those corners, different traditions survived. Ethiopia is the most significant example. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 4th century CE, almost exactly when Rome was consolidating its control over the Western Church. But Ethiopia was not under Roman control. It was a sovereign empire, the Aksumite Empire, one of the most powerful trading civilizations of the ancient world. And because Ethiopia was sovereign, its Christian tradition developed independently. The Ethiopian Church preserved texts that were excluded from the Roman canon. It preserved artistic traditions that reflected the physical description in Revelation, rather than the European image promoted by Rome. It preserved an understanding of the early church that looks strikingly different from what Western Christianity teaches. The Book of Enoch, for example, a text considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, was excluded from the Western Bible. It was preserved almost entirely in its original form in Ethiopian manuscripts. These are not fringe documents. These are ancient texts with serious scholarly credibility. And they paint a picture of early Christianity that is far more connected to African intellectual and spiritual traditions than the standard Western narrative acknowledges. This is not to say that one tradition is right and one is wrong. This is to say that the story is more complex, more diverse, and more African than most Americans were ever taught. Now let me bring this home, because you might be watching this and thinking this is all fascinating history, but what does it have to do with me, right now, in America? Here is the connection. The image of a European Jesus was not just an artistic choice. It was a theological, political, and social tool. When European missionaries came to Africa, to the Americas, to Asia, they brought that image with them. They used that image to tell enslaved and colonized people, God looks like us, not like you. This was documented explicitly in historical records. The relationship between the European image of Jesus and the project of European colonialism is not speculation. It is history that scholars across multiple disciplines have documented extensively. When African Americans were brought to this country in chains, they were often given a Christianity that featured a God who looked like their enslavers. The psychological impact of that, the idea that divinity itself had a European face, was one of the most profound instruments of oppression in American history. And yet, the African American Christian tradition found ways to hold on to its faith, while slowly, over centuries, reclaiming a different understanding of who Jesus was. The civil rights movement was deeply rooted in Black Christianity. And part of what powered that movement was a theology that understood Jesus not as a figure of European power, but as a poor, dark-skinned man from a colonized territory who challenged the most powerful empire of his time, who spoke up for the poor and the marginalized, and who died at the hands of state power. That Jesus, the historical Jesus, looks a lot more like the people who were marching in Selma than the figure in most Western paintings. This is the question I really want you to engage with. Does it change anything for you, personally, to consider that Jesus may have looked different from the image you grew up with? Does it strengthen your faith, shake it, or leave it unchanged? I am asking genuinely, not to provoke, not to offend, because I think this is one of the most important conversations American society needs to have right now, and the comments section of a YouTube video is not a bad place to start it. Now, I want to be intellectually honest here, because some of what I have discussed in this video is not fringe history. Some of it is mainstream academic consensus. Most serious biblical historians and archaeologists, including those at major Western universities, agree on the following points. 1. The European image of Jesus is a post-Nicene artistic development, not a historical representation. 2. The historical Jesus would have had the physical features of a Semitic, Middle Eastern person, darker skin, dark hair, dark eyes. 3. The oldest surviving Christian art, including the catacomb paintings, shows figures with non-European features. 4. The physical description in Revelation is inconsistent with the European Jesus of later Western art. These are not fringe claims. Mainstream scholars like Joan Taylor, a professor at King's College London, have written extensively on the historical appearance of Jesus based on archaeological and textual evidence. The FBI forensic artist Richard Neve famously reconstructed what Jesus likely looked like based on first-century Galilean skulls. The result was a dark-skinned, broad-featured man with short, tightly coiled hair. Not the image in the paintings, not the image in the movies. The actual historical evidence points somewhere very different. And yet, that evidence rarely makes it into the Sunday morning sermon. The question is, why not? Let me bring this together. We have looked at 3 independent lines of evidence tonight. First, the oldest Christian art, predating Roman control, showing a non-European Jesus in the Roman catacombs. Second, the only physical description of Jesus in the biblical text in Revelation chapter 1, describing hair like wool and skin like burnished bronze, preserved most literally in the Ethiopian Christian tradition. Third, the genetic and archaeological science showing that the ancient Judean population had close biological connections to North African populations, not European ones. All 3 of these lines of evidence point in the same direction, and they all point away from the image that was institutionalized after 325 CE. Now, I am not asking you to throw out your faith or your tradition. I am not asking you to accept any single interpretation as final truth. What I am asking you to do is to sit with the evidence, to ask questions that maybe nobody around you is asking. To understand that the image of Jesus that dominates Western culture was not handed down from heaven. It was created by people with political interests in a specific historical moment. And understanding that does not diminish the faith. For many people, it actually deepens it, because it forces you to ask, who is Jesus to me beyond the image? What do the teachings actually say? What does the historical record actually show? And when you strip away 17 centuries of imperial image-making, who do you find? Throughout history, the people who have asked these questions out loud have often paid a price for it. Scholars have had careers damaged, writers have been dismissed as conspiracy theorists, communities have been silenced. But the evidence does not go away because it is inconvenient. The catacomb paintings are still there. The Ethiopian manuscripts are still there. The text of Revelation is still there. The DNA science is advancing every year. And the question, simple, direct, honest, remains: why does the most recognized face in the world look nothing like the person it is supposed to represent? That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a history question, and history questions deserve honest answers. If this video made you think, even if it made you uncomfortable, please share it. Not because I want views, but because these conversations are important, and the more people engage with the actual historical record, respectfully, rigorously, without agenda, the better equipped we all are to understand the world we live in. Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. And until next time, keep asking the questions that make people uncomfortable, because that is where the truth tends to live.